The sea doesn't just hold shipwrecks. It holds the ghosts of ideas that were too wild to live.
Welcome to my collection. Today, we aren't looking at the winners. We're looking at the beautiful, unhinged failures of naval history.
The Russians in the 1870s thought, why make a ship long and fast when you can make it round and stable?
Imagine being the crew. Every time you fire a gun, your entire world starts spinning. Dinner didn't stay down for long on the Novgorod.
But the Russians weren't the only ones with wild dreams. In England, one man wanted to build a ship so big.
The SS Great Eastern, 5 times larger than any ship ever built. A masterpiece of iron, engine.
Imagine a floating barn. No engines, no sleek hull. Just 2 of the biggest guns in the world and a dream of coastal defense.
Because it had no engines of its own, it had to be towed everywhere. It was effectively a very angry, very heavily armed island.
But if you think floating sheds are odd, wait until you see how the Americans solved their pilot shortage on the Great Lakes.
They were coal-burning paddle wheelers. Why? Because they were available, and they didn't need to fear the U-boats in the middle of Lake Michigan. But if paddle wheel carriers seem strange, the British were already working on something truly unhinged.
The British M2 wasn't just a submarine. It was a carrier, hiding a tiny biplane in a hangar that should have been a gun turret.
A door left open for just a second too long, and the M2 became a tomb for her entire crew.
If the British were obsessed with planes, the French wanted a submarine that could outgun a destroyer. Enter the Surcouf.
She was a cruiser submarine, built to hunt merchant ships and fight back against anything that found her. A beautiful, flawed giant.
In 1942, she vanished.
But if the French and British were testing the waters, the Japanese were building an underwater city that could launch a strike on the...
She was longer than a football field. A submarine that made every other sub in the world look like a toy.
The goal was simple and terrifying. Surface off the coast, launch the bombers, and destroy the Panama Canal locks.
But she had a fatal flaw. The hangar was so heavy it had to be offset to one side. If they turned too fast while diving, she'd roll right over.
When the Americans found her, they couldn't believe it.
They'd been looking for a submarine, but they found a monster they didn't even know was possible.
But if the I-400 was a submarine pretending to be a carrier, the Japanese had another idea even more desperate.
When you lose your carriers but still have your battleships, what do? Simple. You cut them in half and hope for a miracle. It was a mess. You couldn't land planes on it, only launch them. And if the big guns fired, the shock waves would damage the planes waiting on.
In the end, they were sunk in shallow water, used as floating batteries. A sad, broken end.
But if the Japanese were desperate in war, the Victorians were arrogant in peace. Let's talk about the ship that was too big for its own century.
In 1858, they didn't just build a ship. They built a monster that was 5 times larger than anything.
The effort to launch her literally killed Brunel. He had a stroke. He died just days before her first voyage. She was a floating city built for a world that didn't have enough passengers to fill her. Too big to dock in most.
It took a ship this large, this unhinged, to lay the first telegraph cable across the Atlantic.
We've seen the giants and the hybrids, but next we go back to the circle. Because if you think a ship can't be a spinning top, you haven't met the Russians yet.
In the 1870s, Admiral Popov of the Russian Navy asked a question that made everyone laugh. Why does a ship have to be long?
It was stable, yes. But whenever it fired its massive guns, the recoil didn't just push the ship back. It made...
In theory, it was brilliant. More armor for less weight. It was a masterpiece of math, but a nightmare of seamanship.
The circles eventually stopped spinning. But as we move into the modern age, the Unhinged didn't change its... As the world moved into the shadows of the Cold War, the madness didn't stop. It just became. The Navy was so obsessed with hiding this ship that they built a giant floating garage just to keep it out of sight of Soviet life.
wasn't a ship, and it wasn't a plane. It was a winged vehicle, a 400-mile...
Even today, we build ships like the Zumwalt, $7 billion apiece, with guns so advanced they have no bullets.
From circular ironclads to flying submarines, we've seen it all. But what does it all mean?
Every one of these ships was called a failure. But without them, we would never have learned how to build the successes we take for granted today.
We laugh at the circular ships and the flying submarines. But remember, the man who tries something new is only a fool until it works.
So next time you see a design that looks a bit unhinged, ask yourself, is it madness or is it